Welcome to another episode of Judge for Yourself. Like many nations around the world, South Africa has indeed been gripped by the conflict which has taken place in Gaza. It has sparked debate, outrage, protest across the country. For example, the ANC Youth League and some pro-Palestinian organizations have called for the expulsion of the Israeli ambassador to South Africa, while others say Israel should be sanctioned altogether. The South African government, however, has taken a much more diplomatic route. It has sent two special envoys to the region in a bid to find a peaceful solution. Now, why this interests me in these programs, which deal essentially with constitutional issues, is that to some considerable extent, our constitutional framework, our normative ideas are supposed to inform the way we look at our foreign policy. And one more thing, our constitution really was predicated on the idea that we pulled back from the brink, we stopped violence, and we became a society which perhaps could teach others how to deal with similar questions. Now, if you'd like to join this debate on Twitter, please use the hashtag JFYGaza. To discuss this topic, we are joined by Avrom Krengel, the chairperson of the South African Zionist Federation, Muhammed Desai from the Boycott, Divestment, Sanction group, and Brooks Spector is an associate editor of the daily Maverick and a former US diplomat. Now, before I start asking the guests, let's frame this debate by looking at what Aziz Pahar, who was a special envoy, said as to why South Africa has not expelled the Israeli ambassador.
There's a necessity for channels of communication to be open to all sides. And I must report that nobody from the Palestinians called on us to break relations or recall our ambassador. In fact, they called on us to intensify our interaction given the gravity of the situation.
So let me ask you this. You, as I understand it, do want the Israeli ambassador to be booted out of the country. Is that right?
We are demanding that the South African government can play a constructive role by isolating Israel, similarly to how apartheid South Africa was isolated during the 1980s, and this will create the necessary conditions for a just peace. As for our South African government, we welcome the special envoys that were sent, we welcome the diplomatic efforts, and as part of that, we are asking our South African government to express a form of diplomatic protest against what Israel did in the Gaza Strip by killing more than 2,000 people, more than 350 children, and to send this diplomatic protest in the form of expelling the Israeli ambassador, recalling the South African ambassador from Israel. These are acts of diplomatic protest that have been taken up by various Latin American countries, as well as the South African government in the past.
My point that I want to make to you is, at this stage, we'll obviously ask other guests, is if we cut diplomatic relations, how then do we play this constructive role? Because after all, if the constructive role is to engage as well with Israel, who, whatever you say about it, is an absolutely significant player in this whole problem, if we say, sorry, get out of here, we don't want to talk to you, surely that means, one, we've essentially cut off that particular possibility. Well, and two, the question arises, which other ambassadors should we kick out who in fact are also representing countries with even more disgraceful records?
Well, the US Secretary of State, John Kerry, has failed to bring Israel to the negotiating table. Where does South Africa think that it's going to be able to bring Israel to the negotiating table? It can bring Israel to the negotiating table by telling it that there is a price to pay for your violations of human rights. Just as how apartheid South Africa was forced to that negotiating table after it lost international support. Boycotts, expulsions, and diplomat and divestments and sanctions are actually positive actions in the interest of Israelis themselves. Let us bring about a lasting, just solution similar to the solution of South Africa by bringing Israeli government to the negotiating table. We can do this here by sending a clear message, by isolating it from the international community.
What, in your view, should the South African government do?
I think this path that they've chosen in this conflict is very constructive. There is very little that South Africa can do to harm Israel. This boycotts, divestments, and sanctions campaign, Israel does not export much here. What it does export is high-tech, systems in major corporations, gadgets, cell phones, etc. So you land up, at the end of the day, what you land up doing because you can't harm Israel, is attacking the South African Jewish community. So we get the death threats from Tony Ehrenreich. Companies that are founded or associated with the South African Jewish community are boycotted for trivial things like grapes.
I'll come to that.
And all you do is import the conflict of the Middle East into South Africa.
Right. We take objection.
As
we take
opposed-
objection
All right,
to
we'll
this.
come to that.
The
Okay.
anti-Semitic card cannot be played all the time by
it's
the
not
Israeli
anti-Semitic.
lobby.
It's not
the
anti-Semitic.
BDS movement.
Wait, you can't have both of you at the same time.
South Africa does. South Africa, but South Africa does have.
I'm sorry, I must insist.
South Africa does have a role.
All right, well, I want to ask you whether that role, I'll come to the other stuff, I promise. I'm not going to not give you both. Let me just ask you this. What, do you accept that the South African government is therefore entitled to criticize Israel?
Absolutely. 100%.
And to say, we don't like this at
Correct,
all. We don't
correct,
want 2,000
correct.
people killed, whatever you may say.
Correct.
So-
criticism of Israel
Yeah.
is if everyone's entitled to whatever criticism
So
they want
what
to.
would
to
you
give.
like the the South African government to do?
I think what the South African government is presently doing is probably one of the most constructive steps that is taken in many a year. It did this about 10 years ago, and that is to bring the parties closer together. It's true that John Kerry's, et cetera, have more leverage on both sides. But what we have is a soft power. What we have is a successful transition. We have close relationships with the Palestinians on the one hand and the Arab states, and on the other hand, they're members of this community that can assist on the Israeli side.
All right.
And we have to try our best.
Okay.
At the risk of engaging in a dreadful truism, we wheel in Winston Churchill and we quote, jaw is better than war. It's important to participate in the discussion rather than to build the wall to close it off. The thing I would note as an observer of the larger diplomatic process, countries like Egypt have taken an active role with relations with the Israeli government in the negotiations that have been ongoing over the various ceasefires in Gaza in the last several days. Countries as different as Saudi Arabia and a number of other Arab states have chosen not to express virulent public disapproval. They have, in fact, quietly encouraged the kind of process that's ongoing. And as you can criticize John Kerry, Secretary of State, for all kinds of things, but it's probably not fair to say that in 1 year he hasn't solved something that has defied other people for half a century.
I want to debate these issues. I have to take a break and then we'll come back. Welcome back. So I want to ask you, I understand where the BDS movement is coming from, and I understand that there were massive financial sanctions against South Africa which were critical in the whole fight against apartheid. What I'm interested in is, what would you want the South African government to do? I mean, apart from rebuking the ambassador, you must have some vision, which is your end game, which you want the South African government to contribute to.
Absolutely. So South Africa can play the role that, for example, various European Union countries are currently playing, and that is placing sanctions on any business dealings with the Israeli settlements or with international companies currently involved in the occupied Palestinian territories. Now, the Israeli representative here today must agree with the South African government position that settlements are illegal, that the occupied Palestinian...
He's only represents the Jewish community.
Well, Mr. Krengel represents the South African Zionist Federation. Can I finish? The South African Zionist Federation. Can I finish? The South African Zionist Federation is an organization that supported apartheid South Africa.
Look, we've got enough problems here without going into the... Let's just deal with the principles. Yes. Okay, carry on.
We celebrate, Mr. Krengel, those brave Jewish South Africans that have come out and supported the BDS campaign and have actually called on the South African government in the name of Judaism to terminate relations with the State of Israel because Israel doesn't represent all Jews across the world. Now, the South African government can play the constructive role by firstly issuing a ban and warning against doing any business with Israeli settlement companies and international companies such as Caterpillar, G4S, Volvo, and others that have operations in occupied Palestinian territories against international law. The South African government can also play a role by prosecuting those South Africans that have served in the Israeli Defense Force.
So would this all be designed to try to pressurize Israel to do what?
This is a positive, constructive role that South Africa can do to bring Israel to the negotiating table. Right. It's not a blocking off.
Can I ask you, do you think Israel also has, that South Africa also has a constructive role to deal with Hamas? Because your critics, I'm well aware of what his critics say. Your critics would say Hamas is an anti-modernity, it's sexist, it's homophobic, it represents complete antithesis of democracy. You can't ever get a kind of secular constitutional state with that set of values. Would you accept that the South African government should be saying something about that too?
I think that firstly there is a problem with the Israeli lobby reducing the Palestinians to Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. This is the usual,
Hamas are pouring rockets across the border. I mean,
well, those rockets that are sent out not by Hamas but by resistance organizations, including Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. There's various organizations, PFLP, various resistance movements. They really are the ways in which the youth of South Africa during the 1980s threw stones out of townships when our apartheid government came and encroached upon our townships.
Issue for the South African, most important issue here. Those youth also said South Africa belongs to all who live in it.
Absolutely.
That's a very different cry to what I'm hearing.
Absolutely, and I think that the BDS movement is all about human rights, and in fact, in the call for boycott, divestment and sanctions in 2005, the leadership of the BDS movement, endorsed by all Palestinian political organizations, made it clear we are against all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism as well as Zionism.
His argument, I think, is to a large degree that the South African, that the South African Jewish community, in a sense, has supported Israel unequivocally. Would it not be helpful to, in a sense, get behind a South African government-type initiative which says, look, the rocket's unacceptable, we can't have any of this, but we are deeply committed to getting on with some form of negotiation to stop this nonsense? Would that not be more helpful? And ask the South African, if your kind of perspective didn't plug into that, wouldn't there be at least some common ground?
That is the position of the Zionist Federation.
But people don't feel that's the position.
It's repeatedly stated. The Zionist Federation's position is very simple. Two states for two people living in peace. That's what we want to attain.
Are you prepared to, would you accept that the South African government have every entitlement to say to the Israeli government, we're not satisfied with the fact that it's tardy at the moment and you've got to do much more?
They're entitled to criticize.
But would it not help if you also got behind that?
I don't see the point of the South African Jewish community, which is essentially pro-Israel, supports the state of Israel and its people, especially in this conflict. This conflict is for most Jewish people, most Israelis, quite a simple conflict. The Israeli government 9 years ago risked a civil war to pull out all of its settlements, all of its soldiers from the Gaza Strip.
Your critics will say there was a blockade shortly
thereafter.
thereafter.
The blockade only came in when Hamas came in and refused, in a sense, to abide by the agreements that the Palestinian Authority had entered into, and hence the blockade was there to stop the arms. But we are totally committed to assisting the South African government to in any way further this peace process, both on the Palestinian and the Israeli side.
Don't you think to some extent that the kind of discourse we're having in this country is decidedly unhelpful?
Well, part of the problem is...
And by the way, not uninfluential in the sense that it sort of positions people in certain ways.
That's the problem. The discourse here speaks to who punched who first and how we're going to even things out. It doesn't, for the most part, talk to, and what happens next, and where do things go after that? I mean, if you look at the Israeli circumstances, they have built this enormously vibrant society that in effect is ignoring its geography. It is where it is, and there's nothing they can do to change that. It is also ignoring, at its considerable peril, the demography of the region. It has to come to grips with the idea that the West Bank, in some way, shape, or form, cannot remain forever under the rule, effectively, of the Israeli army.
Forever. I mean, that's
forever,
a very modest position.
Well, I mean, forever in this case probably speaks to just a few years at the maximum.
At maximum.
The problem is getting from this moment to something that begins to look inevitably toward that. I mean, we've been there before.
But you see, what I'm saying is that what Mr. Desai says is, I mean, let me put it this way. Mr. Krengel's line is, I perfectly understand it. He's saying, we're happy if the South African government does this. Anybody's entitled to criticize. We're committed to a two-state solution. If that's South Africa wants to push that heavily, fine. Mr. Desai says, well, we've gone through this for many times, I'm paraphrasing, many times before. And quite frankly, the one thing we learned from South Africa was that if you have tough financial sanctions, countries start thinking differently.
Well, the tough financial sanctions, of course, had very little to do with the liberation of the country. They were
which country?
This country.
Oh, they had a lot to do with the liberation.
They had very little. The decision to take them was a decision within one bank that it was no longer cost effective to keep the loans.
There was a knock-on effect, and
that's the
huge.
point.
That's my point.
Mr. Davis, the other reason
let
for
me
sanctions.
Let me finish. I'll get back to you.
What has to happen now is what I refer to is the Nixon goes to China moment. Benjamin Netanyahu has to decide in his mind that almost regardless of the consequences, somewhere, somehow, some way, he has to accept the idea that most, perhaps all of those settlements on the West Bank have to come to an end. If they come to an end, it becomes the kind of momentous decision that begins to set other things in motion. There are risks, of course there are risks, but look at the risks now.
Got you. I've got to take an ad break. We'll be back. Welcome back. I want to just ask you this. One of the things we can learn from the South African experience, which is what Mr. Pard's talking about, was Mandela's extraordinary ability to understand the anxieties of his opponents.
Yes.
So he understood that white South Africans felt incredibly anxious. My sense is that we've got two peoples, for all sorts of legitimate reasons, are incredibly damaged. I mean, Israel, because Jews had to suffer the Holocaust and, years of kind of that level of oppression, and Palestinians who have really had an incredibly difficult and oppressed time for quite an unacceptably long period as well. And I just wonder whether the way we shouldn't be shifting the discourse is that if you say to people, we're going to destroy your country, they're hardly likely to say, oh, that's terrific, we'll come to the negotiating table. Surely, in some ways, the South African government's real line should be, can't we replicate that central idea, which is really what seems to me to be critical in breaking a deadlock?
That's the way forward. I think that the future that South Africa was born into was built on the picket lines of the United Democratic Front and of joint struggle between blacks, whites, Indians, Africans, and many other races and religions. Likewise, the future of Palestine and Israel is currently being built on the boycott, divestment, and sanctions picket line, where you have people of various races and religions coming together. I do take, respectfully, Mr. Brooks Spector, I disagree that the protests that we have seen in the last couple of weeks in South Africa has caused disarray amongst our South African community. In fact, we see over 500 members of South African Jewish community departing from the South African Zionist Federation's narrative. We see black, white, and many other religions, Christians, Muslims, and others, coming together and finding each other in the lending of solidarity towards the Palestinian people, and importantly, in lending solidarity towards a campaign that will, in the end, benefit Israelis.
My problem with the Israel-Palestine circumstances is that we really are at a point where somebody has to take the gamble. And that's not primarily going to come externally. It has to come from among the parties themselves.
The most powerful party, with respect, is Israel.
Well, that's where the gamble has to be taken.
Well, Israel and the USA. I mean, the USA also pressurizes countries like Saudi Arabia.
Do you accept that part of the problem that we've got there's a huge level of psychological damage? In other words, when you have charters which say you're going to destroy people, given the fact that it's within living memory that people are exterminated, that this creates the kind of difficulty, and the Palestinians likewise. I mean, isn't the difficulty that we're not really seeing the other with the sort of level of lens that we should?
That's exactly why South Africa has a role. Because it's exactly that. You had two people with two narratives, and somehow they managed to forge a common future. And the way they negotiated that was by the leaders saying, what does your constituency need? What does my constituency need? And we need to go forward. If you look at the Palestinian-Israeli context, the Israelis, all they want, the overwhelming majority, is security. They just want quiet. They have a border with Egypt. They gave back the whole of the Sinai, and they're happy because they have quiet. But the Palestinians need to know that Israel is committed to the creation of its state, that it's a viable state, that will be a prosperous state.
The problem is Brooks Spector's saying correctly, I think, that, all right, let me put a different position to you. David Grossman, one of the really great Israeli novelists, said that Israel embraced peace but once in 1993 and then wasn't serious thereafter. That's his critique.
I think that's unfair to say. The offers of at Camp David and
but an
Taba
Israeli prime minister who tried, it was assassinated.
Yeah, but Ehud Barak was defeated Netanyahu when the people of Israel perceived that the peace was obtainable and Netanyahu was an obstacle. He made an offer, and it led to 5 years of intifada and 1,000 Israelis
but
killed
what I'm trying to say,
in bomb blasts.
It can't be hopeful. I mean, what we should be trying to promote our government to do is precisely that. And we should be contributing to that debate too. It's not helpful to be Ozera Samgai.
You have to...
The moral complexity...
Everyone has to come into the region. And what Brooks is saying, you've got Arab states all of a sudden that are not seeing the conflict between Palestine and Israel, the Palestinians and Israel, in the way that they used to as binary. They want a settlement. They've got much bigger fights on their hands with the Shiites and ISIS, etc., etc. You've got a West that wants something to happen. And I think South Africa can play a role in that. You've got to somehow deliver security for the Israelis and a viable Palestinian state that has borders where it can operate and it can live as a country in the region.
But that viable state is one in which, I mean, Mr. Netanyahu has just said the other day, not going to have it. I mean, you have to be such... I mean, my point that I'm making is, surely our government and our citizenry who are embracing our constitutional vision should be saying, this is what we think should occur. We're not offering you, we're offering you our experience. We're offering you something
100%.
Which is valid.
100%.
Yes, sorry, I want to come to Muhammad, yeah.
Okay, the Constitution in this country speak to a highly moral foreign policy, and yet, in so many other ways, decisions and policies have been taken which are the epitome of real politics.
I haven't come to things like China tonight, but I agree with you entirely. But yes, but you see, what I'm asking is, I mean, if you cut off a communication through kicking out an ambassador, how do you get this kind of dialogue working?
Okay, let us agree on certain things. Mr. Krengel, Mr. Spector, the majority of the world's citizenry, as well as the world's governments, agree the settlements are in violation of international law. The South African government is tired of telling Israel to stop building those settlements. So is the majority of the world. Let the South African government now walk the walk by imposing an immediate ban on any sort of trade with Israeli settlements. Maybe this will will send a clear message to Israel that the time for settlement construction needs to come to an end. The time to come to the negotiating table has arrived.
All right, can I ask you this? Do you not expect that if, as Brooks Spector says, I think it was Nixon going to China, if I could use your metaphor, I don't know when, Netanyahu going to Ramallah, perhaps, unless that happens, we'll be back here in 2 years' time, and he'll have a more powerful case.
I don't know.
Why not?
I don't think so. I think.
Do you not accept that Israel has a burden now to do something?
Both parties do. Both parties do. Absolutely. Israel has to.
But Mr. Abbas has done that. He's prepared to.
And the Israelis will say that they have. Both parties have to recommit, and they have to sit until the violence stops. Until there's an agreement of a cessation of violence on both sides.
The extraordinary thing in South Africa was we suffered far more violence than Israel has had, and we carried on regardless.
Not from the players at the table.
Well, that was true. No, that's not true. In the KwaZulu-Natal area, there was huge violence. And the greatness of Mandela, and to some extent de Klerk, was they kept soldiering on.
Correct.
There are going to be people who want to subvert this. It's just not possible
Absolutely,
to think otherwise.
100%.
What do you say then?
I think that talks about peace, and yet he bombs 2,000 people. He talks about peace, he builds settlements.
Yes,
he talks about peace, he increases the occupation. Now, security is vital
he's
for
only
all.
Bombing, he's only bombing because he's being bombed by 3,000 rockets.
Security is vital for all in that
There
region.
is only one solution,
The
whether it's
security
this
is
year or
vital.
5 years, and that is a peace deal. That is a peace
All right,
deal.
yes.
Unfortunately, the moment you have that kind of conversation, now we're back at the who struck John first.
Rather than actually trying to move it forward, I accept that. And that's what I was trying to do.
But we must talk about international law. We must talk about human rights. We must talk about holding Israel accountable for its violations of international law.
I've got to stop. I'm sorry. I'll have you all back again. And I hope that in 2 years' time, and have to have this
To
whole thing
celebrate
again.
a free Palestine.
Well, to celebrate at least no violence
A peaceful
and
region.
that peace for everybody. Yes. Well, that's perhaps the best close I can have. But the point about it is, this country did do a remarkable thing, and we forget it. And we do have lessons to teach others. We obviously aren't as powerful as the United States of America, but we have some moral authority. And our foreign policy was supposed to be built on moral authority. And it's that moral authority that should be used, it seems to me, in our foreign policy to deal with these kinds of questions. How that works out, whether Mr. Pard's view is correct, Mr. Desai's, Mr. Krengel's, that's for you to judge for yourself. Goodbye.